We are thrilled that you've joined us today for our conversation, which we've called Pulling Together, Breaking Apart, COVID and the Power of Community. And we think you'll understand really soon why we've chosen that title. We're excited about this conversation. I'm Stephanie Adler-Yuan. As I mentioned, I'm Director of Programs here at the Schwartz Center. As many of you know, we are a Boston-based nonprofit organization, and we were established 26 years ago in 1995 to advance compassion in healthcare, a very, very broad mission. Many of you I know are familiar with our signature program, the Schwartz Rounds, which is offered in hundreds of member organizations around the world. The Schwartz Center is all about bringing people together so that we can connect through our shared humanity. And that's some of what we're going to talk about here today. My colleague, Dr. Beth Lown, will introduce our guest in a moment, but before she does, just a quick note of thanks and also logistics. First of all, I want to acknowledge with gratitude that this series, the Compassion in Action webinar series, has been funded by a generous donation made in memory of Julian and Eunice Cohen, a wonderful legacy. Today's program will last 60 minutes, and we'll have a conversation between Dr. Lown and Dr. Christakis for the first 45 minutes or so, and we'll do our best to leave lots of time for questions, which we know you'll have. Feel free to enter your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A throughout the webinar, and we'll keep an eye on that as we move through. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Beth. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome to everybody. I am really excited to have this conversation with you, Nicholas. First, I'm going to introduce you. So Dr. Nicholas Christakis, he's a physician, a sociologist, a public health expert, a social network scientist, and he's known for his many accomplishments in each and every one of these fields. He's the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University, where he directs the Human Nature Lab and also co-directs the Yale Institute of Network Science. He is a fellow of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's also a best-selling author. Most recently, Apollo's Arrow, the profound and enduring impact of coronavirus on the way we live. And before then, Blueprint, the evolutionary origins of a good society. And most of his work now, I would say, focuses on exploring how human beings interact in groups. So good afternoon, Nicholas. A little crazy way to start the webinar.
I have to explain to everyone the reason I look sopping wet is that I am sopping wet. Just as we were in the preamble getting ready, the power went out where I am, and I had to run down to the generator to fire it up in the rain, and that's why I'm drenched in water right now. So I apologize for my appearance. Yes, so we can talk.
We're excited to have you. Whatever. Okay, so anyway, I'm just really excited to sort of explore the arc of your work and your thinking over time. And I know that you actually went to Harvard Medical School and you got your MD from there and you got your MPH from the Harvard School of Public Health. You did your residency, but then somewhere along the line, you decided to get a PhD in sociology, and you studied with Renee Fox, who I think was one of the first scholars to apply the methods of sociology to understand medical care and training, as well as the social context of health and illness. And I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit about what about you actually, or your family, you know, in your family's context and how they think, what led you to that pathway of study? If you can help us understand that. And that's my first question. And then the second is, how did that sort of sociological way of thinking about the world, if you will, how did that influence your thinking?
Well, there's that famous scene in the Philadelphia Story where Catherine Hepburn goes, you know, we're going to talk about me, goody. You know? So, well, I mean, I don't want to belabor it too much, but when I went to medical school, I had wanted to be a reconstructive surgeon and reattach severed extremities. And when I got there at Harvard Medical School, during an embryology lecture, and I think the name of my professor was Elizabeth Hay, if I remember her name correctly, we had a visiting talk by Joe Murray, who was at the time doing craniofacial plastic surgery. He had previously invented renal transplantation, for which he won the Nobel Prize ultimately. And I went up to him during first year of medical school and I was like, oh, Dr. Murray, can I come and operate with you sometime? And, you know, he was like, he was a nice guy nice enough, but, you know, he's like, I don't have time for you. Go talk to another colleague of mine. And he introduced me to this wonderful man by the name of John Mulliken, who was a magnificent surgeon at Children's Hospital. And I basically skipped the first year of medical school and was operating with John and just had incredible experiences in my life at that stage of life. But one of the things I learned is that I was not cut out to be a surgeon. There were lots of reasons surgery did not sit well with me. And I decided to do internal medicine. And then my mother was very sick. My mother was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease when I was 6. She ultimately died when I was 25 in medical school. She was 47 when she died. And she was terminally ill, but after my second year of medical school, and I needed to do something that would be a little bit easier for me than do third year medical school while my mother was dying. So I elected to do an MPH. I also had intellectual interest. It wasn't just expedient. I was affirmatively interested in public health. So I decided to do that. And while I was in there, I took a class. I don't remember with who. It might have been Alan Brandt that taught it. I can't remember, but someone was teaching a class and I read Renee Fox's Training for Detached Concern and Training for Uncertainty. And I was stunned because she wrote those in the 50s and yet they were so applicable still 40 years later. And it sort of impressed on me the idea that there was something constant about being a physician that transcended time. And I found that very moving and interesting intellectually. And so over the course of the latter part of my time as a medical student, I decided I wanted to be focused more on public health, kind of communal, sociological, social sciencey type topics, epidemiological type topics, sort of population level rather than clinical care. And there was this program called the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program at Penn. And because Renee was at Penn, I applied and was admitted to that program. And then I moved from Harvard to Penn and spent 6 years there and got my PhD in sociology with Renee. And as part of the training for sociology, you have to take a class, or I think we're required to take a class in network science. So I was introduced to network science, which is sociologists invented network science, actually. It's an interesting intellectual history. And anyway, so that's part of the trajectory. And along the way, I decided to do it clinically. I decided to do hospice medicine.
Right.
And then went in 1995 from Penn to Chicago as an assistant professor, and I was clinically active as a hospice doctor. And then I should shut up, but then there was a direct connection between that and network science, actually, which I can tell you if you're interested.
Well, that was probably through your study of widowhood. Am I right about that?
Yeah, exactly. So I became very interested in how a person's death might affect their family, and in particular their spouse, which is a reductionistic kind of focused dyadic interaction. And this is also an old topic, goes back actually 300 years. And there's a very famous paper called Dying of a Broken Heart that was published by C. Murray Parks in the 1960s, I think, in the British Medical Journal. And so I decided to revisit that topic as my research, to look at the widowhood effect. And in the course of doing that work and being a practicing hospice doctor, and also I was interested in, is it the case that if we take better care of the decedent, quite apart from the benefits of the decedent, do we reduce risk of death of the surviving spouse? Can we attenuate the widowhood effect by optimizing care of the dying? Mm-hmm. And we did some work that tended to show that, and others also have done such work. And I believe that's true. And so then at some point in the 1990s, I realized that this widowhood effect that I was studying was a simple case of a broader phenomenon, which was network effects more generally. And I remembered the work I had done in my training in sociology on network science. And in the late 1990s, there was a huge efflorescence, a resurgent interest in networks that came from all kinds of larger trends in the sciences: genetic networks, engineering networks, computer networks, neural networks, and big data. And there was a big ferment in that area. And so I decided to redirect my lab to study those topics. And basically, I spent the last 20 years, therefore, studying human social interactions.
Yeah. Okay, now I get the sociology network science thing. I should have known, but I didn't really think about how sociology was probably among the originators of network science. It makes a lot of sense.
It's one of the rare cases in which, sociology is not a very high status field, unfortunately. It had its heyday in the 50s, actually, in some ways, when Renee was also working with Talcott Parsons. But it has made some landmark contributions, for example, in the study of religion, and in the study of inequality, and in the study of networks. And a lot of the fundamental ways we have of quantifying networks were invented by sociologists, and believe it or not, flowed to the biochemists and the geneticists who began to study gene networks and trying, for example, to compute what is a central gene in a network of genes. And they said, oh, wait a minute, the sociologists have ways of computing who's a central person in a network of people. Let's just use those methods. So there was it's a case in which you find the impact of, in my view, the impact of sociology was quite substantial in the sciences more generally.
That's really interesting. So let's talk a little bit about this stuff about how do things spread through social networks, because it's a little bit mystifying. I think, I listened to one of your first TED Talks about this when you were studying how obesity, spreads through social networks using the Framingham data, longitudinal study of that population over a very long time. It was launched in 1948, really, to study risk factors for cardiovascular disease and like. So can you explain in sort of simple terms, how could something like obesity, and then I want you to get to emotions, but first obesity, how does that spread through social networks?
Well, first of all, just to jump ahead for a moment as a tangent, my lab and many labs around the country have now added a huge body of empirical work using experiments to show that we can induce the spread of phenomena. So for example, we work in many developing world countries, in Uganda, in India, in Honduras. We have a large longitudinal study where we try to randomly assign thousands of people in different villages. We have like 176 villages and 30,000 people. We will randomly assign the villages to different network targeting algorithms. So for example, in this village, 10% of the people are picked in this fashion, let's say at random. And in this village, 10% are picked according to those who we believe, based on mathematics, have the biggest cascade effects, can induce the biggest spillover effects. Mm-hmm. Then both 10% get the same treatment, get the same, let's say, educational intervention. And we've been able to show that we can create artificial tipping points. We can foster cascades in behaviors and attitudes and a whole host of things. It's a little bit like if you were a bioterrorist and you could infect one person in a village, who would you infect? I mean, you wouldn't infect the hermit that has no interactions. You should have the intuition that there's somebody that you could pick. If you infected them, you'd get a bigger epidemic, a super spreader, for example. So we've been able to show using experiments that this is possible, both in face-to-face networks and in online networks. We've done a lot of experiments to do that, to show this using thousands and thousands of people. But the original project that James Fowler and I did beginning in 2001, when I was then on the faculty at Harvard, involved what we wanted to do. I don't know how much time to spend on this. Did you want me to tell?
No, it's interesting. I think people would like to hear your original hypothesis about how things spread.
So there's some serendipity there, which I don't often have a chance to tell this story. Actually, what happened was, what we wanted to do was, I was then an assistant professor. No, I was a full professor already, but just at start, I was 40 years old. And what we wanted to do was to pick a sample of 1,000 people, have them nominate their friends, let's say an average 5 people per person. So that'd be 1,000 seeds, 5,000 friends, and have those people nominate their friends, an average of 5 per person. That'd be 25,000 people. So 1 plus 5 plus 1 is 31,000 people. We wanted to empanel into a new cohort and follow it prospectively. And we did some cost calculations. It was like $25 million. So I contacted this program officer at NIH and I said, we'd like to do the study and it's $25 million. He goes, are you kidding me? This don't be ridiculous. And anyway, he said, do you have any pilot evidence that this works and so on? So then, because of his pushing back on me, I said, well, what if instead of starting from scratch, I could find a local cohort in the Boston area and who had been followed already by someone else and ask them who their friends were and do that. So I approached a lot of studies that were being done, including a bunch of cardiac studies that were run out of the TIMI trial that was being done at the time out of HMS. And I went to the Framingham Heart Study to meet with them there. And then I had one of those most amazing experiences of my life. which is I had gone there in a kind of due diligence way to understand how they track their subjects. And I met with a woman by the name of Marion Bellwood, whose responsibility it was to, she was an administrator with a study, whose responsibility it was to track the participants. Because as you all probably know, the Framingham study has almost no attrition, which is unbelievable. Like in 50 years, they lost 10 people or something, just crazy. And I'm talking to Marion, and she says, I said, how do you do that? And she says, well, we have these paper records where every time someone comes in every 4 years, we ask them, where do you work? Who are your friends? Who are your family? Where do you live? And all this stuff. And it just suddenly dawned on me like a bolt of lightning that because this was such a tight community, when those people said, Susie is my friend, Bob is my friend, by dumb luck, Bob would also be in the Framingham Heart Study. And therefore, if I could computerize those records, we could reconstruct the network among these thousands of people going back 30 years. And that was much lower cost. So that's the project we pitched to NIH. And it took years, 2 years to get the funding and 2 years to computerize the records and another year to get the software to work. It was a long effort. And then we finally had the data to analyze these spreading processes in these networks. Could we discern evidence, not just that germs spread in networks, but that ideas and behaviors spread? Right. And the reason we picked obesity, and then I'll shut up. The reason we picked obesity, well, the reason we picked obesity is that it was, we were affirmatively interested in obesity, but the real reason we picked obesity first was that it was objective. They got on the scale. We didn't have to rely on the ego, the respondent, to tell us their attitudes or their behaviors, or whether they smoked, for example. You know, they were weighed. I mean, it was objective. And it was continuously distributed, which had certain desirable statistical properties. And so that's why we picked obesity first. And then we found what we found, which was evidence that there's cascade effects. As I gain weight, the idea is that as I gain weight, it might modify the behavior of my friends. For example, I might start eating muffins and beer. There's a terrible combination, but you know, I start eating muffins and beer, and my friends start seeing me eating muffins and beer, and they copy my behaviors and they gain weight. Or also, we found evidence for a normative effect, such that as I gain weight, it changes my friends' ideas about what an acceptable body size is. It changes the threshold. And so it permits them to gain weight as well, is the idea. And of course, these effects don't stop at 1 degree, they keep spreading. Anyway, that's what we were able to show observationally.
Right. So through behaviors, norms, things like that is how
and incidentally, we also speculated in that original paper is that there also could be an element of biological contagion. For example, certain microbiome species or certain viral species could move from person to person and modify the commensal bacteria in your gut and change the way you absorb nutrients. And now my lab is doing some work, like 20 years later, is doing some work on the microbiome. We are in Honduras, we're collecting microbiome specimens and doing metagenomic analyses of thousands of people. And we're going to revisit this topic about whether we can find evidence of that part of the reason that you gain weight when your friends gain weight, or incidentally, that you become depressed when your friends become depressed, is a sharing of bacterial species, which are known to affect those outcomes within individuals. Or let's say there's a lot of suggestive evidence that your microbiome is associated with your BMI and is associated with your depression status. Now the question arises, can we find evidence that if the microbiome spreads between people, does that also partly explain the spread of these other ostensibly non-communicable conditions like depression and obesity?
It's unbelievable, really. You know, we're such a small little piece in this just vast universe of interacting parts, right?
Yes. And here's a crazy idea that I think about. It's a very crazy idea, but let me see if I can explain it. So the question is, all of us listening to this think that we are the important thing, that we have bodies and minds and are individuals, and that the connections between us are not, and we're visible, you know, we have a physical existence, and the connections between us are invisible, ephemeral, insubstantial, mutable, inconstant, that one thing is, solid and there, and the other thing is kind of light and, not there. But what if, in fact, it's these networks that endure? these networks that have, because the networks, these social networks are themselves a product of, first of all, of natural selection. We've done a ton of work in my lab looking at the evolutionary origins of networks and friendship. But what if these networks, which are themselves features of the natural world, what if they are the things that endure and we merely occupy slots in those networks temporarily? You know, that our bodies are the interchangeable ones. And it actually, it's not so crazy to think about that, because we come and go, but these networks endure. It's just like, it's like the idea that, this is an old Durkheimian idea, you know, that there's something fundamental about French Protestants compared to French Catholics. He was looking at their suicide rate that is constant across time, even though the occupants, the French Catholics and French Protestants, whole cohorts of them died and were replaced by new French Catholics and Protestants, and yet the suicide rate was constant across time. So it's something permanent about the groups, you see. And so if you start thinking about it that way, at least to me, it totally shifts my gaze. Can I say one more example of this that is?
Let's go.
So there's this incredible thing, and there's actually I learned about this a long time ago, and then I subsequently learned that there's this wonderful 4-minute TED Talk about this, which may interest you. But here's the idea. We think that streets have names. Okay, all the streets in our city have names, and then the houses on the streets are numbered, you know, in sequence along the streets. And we think the streets are the important thing. And if I asked you, well, what's between the streets? You would say the blocks. There's nothing between the streets. There's blocks are there, but they're houses on the street that have numbers. And so you focus on streets and you overlook the blocks. Now in Japan, it's the opposite. The blocks have names and the houses are numbered in the sequence in which they were built. And if you ask the Japanese, well, what's between the blocks? They say nothing. There's a street between the blocks. Who cares about the street? And incidentally, I am told that this is one of the reasons that fax machines have been so important in Japan. You have to fax maps. When you're telling someone how to come to your house, you have to fax them a map, because if the blocks are named and the houses are numbered in the order in which they were built, it's not as easy to navigate as it would in us.
Yeah.
But the point is, from one perspective, the streets are important and the blocks are unimportant. And from another perspective, it's the opposite. And that's the same with the social networks. From one perspective, it's the people that are important and the ties between them are unimportant. But you could turn that on its head and say, actually, what's important is the ties. And we ourselves are mere occupants, temporary occupants in this bigger social fabric. Anyway, I don't mean to get too transcendent, but that's how I've been thinking about networks for a while now.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's really fascinating. And, you know, I know very little bit, you know, about the microbiome, but, you know, that's an even bigger, you know, concept. You know, we are just like one tiny little piece of the microbiome, right?
Yeah. And that if you think about it, our networks are the environment for the microbiome to evolve. Like we are just the hosts for these microbes.
Yeah.
And there are, in fact, very complicated interactions between us and these microbes that are quite interesting, actually. And we're beginning to do some work on that.
So, you know, you said you were talking about the enduring aspects of social networks, and that kind of fits in with your book about Blueprint, about the social suite, which you believe endures throughout time, over evolutionary time, because you think in terms of evolutionary time, not lifetime, right? So can you just talk a little bit about that suite and help people understand what you were talking about in that book?
So the overarching, in that book, Blueprint, the overarching ideas in that book are that, first of all, that for too long, in my view, people have focused on the dark side of human nature, on how natural selection has equipped us to be violent or hateful or mendacious, and that the bright side has been denied the attention it deserves, because equally we are capable of love and friendship and cooperation and teaching and all these magnificent, wonderful qualities. And in fact, that I would argue that it must be the case that these benefits of social life must have outweighed the costs. In other words, when I come near you, I expose myself to risk of you feeding me misinformation or stealing my stuff or brutalizing me or chilling me. But equally, when I come near, or getting a germ from you, I could get infected from you. Or equally, when I come near you, I can derive benefits. And that's so we've been shaped, natural selection has shaped our capacity for living socially in very particular ways, and that the benefits of a connected life must have outweighed the costs. And so the question then becomes, well, what are the core social attributes that natural selection has shaped? So the secondary big idea is that and this of course goes back to E.O. Wilson, I mean, I'm not the first one to think about this, of course, and others have been thinking, Darwin has been thinking about this, is that just like our genes have something to do with the structure and function of our bodies, evolution has something to do with the structure and function of our bodies, and also with the structure and function of our minds, our genes also have something to do with the structure and function of our societies. And so the question is, well, what are those things that relate not to who we are and what happens in our brain, but how we interact? And I call that the social suite. There are 8 traits that have been shaped by natural selection: our capacity for love, friendship. Friendship is actually very interesting. Many animals mate with each other, have sex with each other. Of course, we do too, but we don't just mate with each other. We form long-term non-reproductive unions to unrelated members of our species. Namely, we have friends. And this is very rare in the animal kingdom. We do it, certain other primates do it, elephants do it, certain cetacean species do it. And wolf packs are different because they're often cousins or siblings, and horse herds are also a little different. And alligator, we could talk about the other examples and the eusocial insects. But anyway, something very special about what mammalian social networks, namely we have friends. And so love, friendship is uncommon. Networks that we make as a result of friendship, cooperation, we are kind to strangers who are unrelated to us. Altruism is a difficult topic to understand, but very deep and fundamental about us. Mild hierarchy, we arrange ourselves to mild hierarchy. In-group bias, which is a little depressing. We prefer the company of people we resemble. And then teaching. I think I got all 8, I don't remember. Anyway, these are all things that a natural selection has endowed us with, which are mostly good things. And so that's the argument of the book. The final sentence of the book is that the arc of our evolutionary history is long, but it bends towards goodness.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of MLK's statement about the long arc of history bending towards.
Yes, of course, that's the illusion.
Yeah. So people want to know something about, well, what happened in COVID? How do you make sense of what happened to our social networks?
So I think the impact on our social lives because of this pandemic is temporary. And I think it's very important to understand that we have been, this way that we have come to live, and this is the subject of the other book, Apollo Zero, which I wrote unexpectedly. I wasn't planning on writing it, but then we had the pandemic. This way we've come to live right now feels very alien and unnatural to us.
Right.
But it's crucial to understand that plagues are not new to our species. They're just new to us. I mean, we think this is crazy that we have to live this way, but plagues have been afflicting human beings for thousands of years. They're in the Bible. They're in the Iliad, right? One of the canonical works of Western fiction, the Iliad, begins with a plague, right? Apollo is smiting the Greeks for the crises because Agamemnon had taken as his slave Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo. They're in Shakespeare, they're in Cervantes. So plagues are a part of the human existence. And therefore, it's important to understand that the plague will eventually end. We'll see the other side of this, and we will return to a kind of status ex ante in terms of our social interactions. So on the long arc, my answer to the question is that the germs, well, on the intermediate arc, the germs do not reshape our social interactions. On the short arc, they do, like over the course of weeks, months, and years. Over the course of a decade, they don't, but over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, they might. And the idea here is that we co-evolved with these pathogens. And earlier I mentioned that I come near you, maybe to benefit from learning from you, because you teach me stuff, and being a social animal is helpful to me. Let me do a digression on a digression. Let's say you build a fire, and you put your hand in the fire and you burn your hand. And you've learned something, fire burns. That's called independent learning. You learn that fire burns, but you paid a price. So it was expensive knowledge. Or I could watch you build a fire and I get almost as much learning, but I pay none of the price. I mean, you burned your hand, I learned the fire burns. That's really efficient. That kind of social learning is super efficient. Many, many animals learn independently. A little fish can learn that if it swims up to the light, it'll find food there. We also learn independently, but we also learn socially by observing others around us. For example, we go into the forest together, you eat red berries and die. You've paid a huge price for the knowledge. I watch you eat red berries, I learn not to eat them. That's efficient. But we do something even more, and other animals do this, although that's much rarer, but we do something that's exceptionally rare in the animal kingdom, which is we affirmatively teach each other things. We set out to teach you how to build a fire. This is very rare. So one way to think about this is that I come near you to learn from you, but in so doing, expose myself to risk of epidemic disease.
Mhm.
So the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas. And the same networks that we built across which the germs spread are the networks which we build across which the ideas spread. But the irony, and so over a sweep of evolutionary history, over hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of years or more, I believe that evolution has shaped our social networks to counterbalance the risks and benefits of social interaction. So I gain more from learning from you than I lose from exposing myself to epidemic disease, because that's a cost. You know, if we wanted to avoid all epidemics, we would be atomistic animals. We would not live socially. Then we could never get contagious diseases. We each lived separately and just came together to reproduce, for example, you know, one-on-one occasionally. But that's not how we live. We live socially. So therefore, the costs of the benefits of a connected life must outweigh the costs. So, and then therefore, one of the ironies of the COVID epidemic is just like the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas. Ironically, it's the spread of ideas that has allowed us to master COVID. I mean, think about it. How did we combat this ignorant pathogen, this mindless germ, which is killing us? Well, we banded together. We shared knowledge with our ancestors. We scientists banded together. We cooperated, scientists around the world. Tens of thousands of people volunteered to take risks and be in studies. They cooperated. They were altruistic. So our species, our social nature, and all these evolved capacities were actually the tools we used to beat back the pathogen.
Right. You know, it's so hard to focus on that positive way of looking at things, though, Nicholas. I mean, for some reason, and maybe this has to do with networks as well, and you can sort of illuminate this. Why is it that negativity and just sort of negative perspectives seem to spread so rapidly and with such a loud voice and occupy so much of our attention compared with this other kind of positive view of humanity?
Well, I can't vouch for others, but you know, I'm dispositionally an optimist. I marvel at our species. I think we're a remarkable species with many extraordinary capacities. Of course, we have I'm not ignorant of our propensity to violence and hatred. And you can pick any century and it's replete with horrors. You know, we slaughter each other, we enslave each other. You know, we torture each other. I mean, it's just awful what we're capable of, but equally we are capable of tremendous goodness. And certainly that's, as I said, I think it's scientifically less studied. So it interests me scientifically, but it also interests me dispositionally. Like I'd rather focus on the good things than the bad things. First point. On the issue of spreading processes and graphs, for example, does unhappiness spread more easily than happiness? Or does bad news spread more easily than good news? Or does hatred spread more easily than love? That's a difficult and complicated topic, which we can talk a little bit about. But bringing it back to the COVID pandemic, there are many remarkable things. Yes, during times of plague, people have abandoned their loved ones to die alone. Incidentally, we saw dying alone. I mean, I could not believe, as a former hospice doctor, I could not believe how ill-prepared our nation was, such that the lack of PPE and the inundation of our hospitals required that hundreds of thousands of Americans die alone. I mean, when I was a practicing hospice doctor, we spat blood to avoid that outcome.
Right.
And it just is a deep shame, like it's an immoral thing that happened in our society. And I'm pleased to see that many hospitals are better prepared for the next waves, or we're better prepared to care for people. We have more PPE, we are more structured. But anyway, it is true that in other plagues, people have been abandoned, people have resorted to violence. There's countless examples during the bubonic plague of anti-Semitism, where thousands of Jews were burnt at the stake because they were blamed. During the HIV epidemic, homosexuals were blamed, or Haitians were blamed, or IV drug users were blamed. And during the COVID epidemic, immigrants were blamed. So there is these awful things that we do, yes. But we also do these wonderful things. And the quote that I happen to have this on my desk, so this wasn't set up, but the quote that I love on this regard is of course from Albert Camus' The Plague. And this is a fictional account of an outbreak in a village called Oran in Algeria in the 1940s, but Camus based it on a cholera outbreak from 1849, and of course was informed by other outbreaks of bubonic plague. And the protagonist in the novel is a Dr. Rieux. And here's what Camus writes. Dr. Rieux resolved to compile this chronicle so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure, and to state quite simply what we learn in time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men and women than to despise. And that's exactly how I feel. So the good things are the things I'd rather focus on.
That's wonderful. I love that quote. So we have some questions coming up.
Can I tell you one more story, since we're telling some stories?
Love it.
So when I was a medical student, maybe some of you will have heard this same NPR story. Maybe someone miraculously will be able to find this. I was driving on Mass Ave, and I heard an interview. I think the study was being done at MIT, and they were doing CT scans or MRI. It must have been CT scans. Maybe it was early MRI scans. I don't remember, of Buddhist monks' brains. So this was, remember, the heyday when they were trying to figure out, like, is brain structure different across people for various reasons. And they interviewed this monk. And the monk, these Buddhist monks, apparently through self-discipline, they're able to modify in ways that we can discern the volume of different parts of their brain. Actually similar to London taxi drivers, who the part of the brain associated with navigation abilities is said changes. And they're interviewing this guy, and I'm driving along, I'm in my early 20s. And the monk is talking about how he re-narrates the life around him. He tries to see things in a positive light. And the interviewer says, well, what if, you're cut off in traffic, which is a very Boston question to ask the monk, like someone cuts you off in traffic in an awful way, how would you deal with that? And I'm listening to this, and the monk, without missing a beat, says, well, he says, I would begin to tell myself a story. Perhaps the car is being driven by a man, and he's in a big hurry.
Yeah, I remember.
Because his wife is in the back seat, and she's delivering a baby, and they're in a hurry to get to the hospital. And isn't it amazing that a new life is coming into the world? And I pulled over and listened to this man and was astonished and said, oh my God, I wish I could be like that. I wish I could be more like that guy, that monk, So that, I think there's something valuable in that lesson, to the extent where none of us are Buddhist monks. Maybe some of us are, I don't know, but certainly no one I know on this call is. The ability to do that, I think, is a really wonderful ability, and it's worth cultivating.
Yeah, that's assuming positive intent and compassion.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure that was Mathieu Ricard, the name of the monk, and the guy doing that study was probably Richie Davidson. He was the first neuroscientist to really start imaging the brains of long-term meditators and looking at the enlargement of those parts of the brain associated with compassion.
If you remember, Beth, would you just email me those names?
Yeah, sure.
And I will try to find that original. It would be very moving to me if I could find that original.
Yeah, I actually kind of remember it myself, but yes, I shall do that. We have some great questions coming, and they're kind of circling around similar themes. People really want to know about if we can apply the influence of social networks to benefit humankind. Is it possible that we can do this? And if so, what can you explain that? What in your studies, what in your experiments? I know you've been doing some of this with public health messaging and things like that, probably in Honduras. But if you can explain a little bit of that, how does that work? How can we use that?
Yeah, so we've done a ton of work on that in my lab. Many experiments now in the last 10 or 20 years involving tens of thousands of people. Let me give you a flavor for some of these experiments. So when you want to exploit an understanding of human social networks to intervene in networks to make the world better, for example, to facilitate the adoption of breastfeeding practices in a developing world village, or facilitate the adoption of vaccination in the face of an epidemic, or you want to decrease racism online, or you want to enhance cooperation online, or you want to facilitate the diffusion of innovation in a firm. You want to make the firm more inventive and creative, for example. There are three broad categories of interventions that you can use from networks: connection, contagion, and position. I'm not going to discuss position today, it'll take too long, but let me discuss connection and contagion. Connection is a set of interventions where you manipulate the structure of the interactions. So you try to figure out, okay, well, how can I arrange these people, introduce who to who, in a way that fosters the emergence of some desirable property. So for example, Alcoholics Anonymous, you take a group of 10 people who didn't know each other, they were strangers to each other. By bringing them together and fostering connections among them, you might be able to elicit the emergence of a new property, which is the ability to stay abstinent.
Right.
So it's the structuring, the creation of those ties in that simple example. Or another metaphor that I often use is carbon. We all of us learned in high school, if you take carbon atoms and assemble them one way, you get graphite, which is soft and dark. Or you can take the same carbon atoms and assemble them another way, and you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are two key intellectual ideas there. First of all, these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness aren't properties of the carbon atoms, they're properties of the collection of carbon atoms. The whole is bigger than the sum of its parts, as you said earlier. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. And it's the same with human groups. We've shown in our experiments, I can take a group of people, and if I assemble them one way, they're really kind and sweet to each other and they cooperate. Or I can take the same people and arrange their ties in a different fashion, and they're mean sons of bitches to each other. So that meanness is not just a property of individuals, it's a property of groups, which can be engineered by modifying the structure of interactions. And we've done many experiments of this kind showing that we can do this. And this also, we can manipulate the structure of groups to, for example, facilitate how innovative they are. Or using certain other kinds of interventions, we can optimize the flow of desirable information. For example, if you want to accelerate the flow of truth and suppress the flow of falsehood, there are certain kinds of graphs, social structures, which attend to that. So that's connection. Now, contagion is a different set of interventions. So, and you can use to intervene in the world to make it better. Here, the idea is, okay, you have an existing structure of interactions in a village, in a city, in a firm, in a school, and you can't force people to be friends with each other or whatever. But you can ask yourself, whose idea or behavior do I need to change such that if I change their idea or behavior, they maximize the spread of that idea or behavior in the system. It's like that bioterrorist example I mentioned earlier. If you only could infect one person, who do you infect to get the most sick people? Okay, so that's a contagion intervention. And we've shown in a number of experiments, and others have done similar work, that, for example, we can go into villages in India and Honduras and in Uganda, and we can identify in a village who is structurally influential using some mathematical algorithms, and educate them about, let's say, latrine usage or vaccination or breastfeeding or cord care in newborns. And then if they adopt the practice, we can create an artificial tipping point and get the whole village to change. So we've done many experiments like that. So those are some of the ways, using connection and contagion interventions, that one can use insights from network science to make the world better.
It's pretty impressive, and yet I'm getting this a little bit of a fear in my heart, because can't it also be used to negative purpose?
Yes, it can. it's like any technology. It's a dual use technology. You know, methotrexate is a mustard gas, but also an anti, you know, a nuclear energy is used for nuclear bombs, but it can also be used for you know, nuclear power. And the, you know, of course, the word pharmakon comes from the Greek, means poison and medicine. So and Apollo, in Apollo's era, Apollo was both the giver of disease and the god of healing. Many ancient religions saw this duality. So you're absolutely right, Beth. These technologies can be used for ill. They can be used, for example, to subvert cooperation or to foster the diffusion of undesirable, of lies, of useless products. You know, we can have marketing to make us buy stuff that we don't need. So yes, they can be.
Yeah. So it's a tricky thing, but the power of it is so profound. We're getting a lot of questions and you know, chat and things like that in the Q&A. I think people also are really interested in, you know, in our lives as practitioners on the front lines, as we say. I hate that military analogy, but forgive me, it's very commonly used. You know, how can we learn and use the lessons of the power of social networks within our organizations to help each other come together rather than to break apart, as you say in your Apollo's Arrow book?
Well, there are, it's hard to make. So first point, I would back up and I would say, it is not the case that there's one kind of network structure that is best for every challenge. For example, if you're organizing terrorist cells, you want a different kind of network structure than if you're organizing a highway cleanup crew. For example, everyone knows that in terrorist cells, you don't want people densely interconnected so that if one guy is arrested, he can't rat out everyone else. So you want a sparse network. This is a simplified example, but in a sports team, for example, you might have a very dense network. Everyone really is friendly with each other, knows each other, has gotten to know each other, can anticipate the other's moves. So I don't have a generic set of tips that I could give you that applies, because the answer is it depends. It depends specifically on what you're trying to do. And I'll give you a couple of examples in just a moment. That's my first overarching principle. Second thing I would say is that generally speaking, one very underappreciated thing that people can do when they attend to their network, it's not just about cultivating more connections, it's also about fostering connections between your connections. So introducing your friends to each other is a very important thing that you can do to help knit the network around you together in beneficial ways, usually in beneficial ways, because if you do too much of that, that also is, in certain circumstances, is not good for a network. So I can't give you a simple answer to this, but I can tell you that networks matter. And depending on the challenge, whether you're trying to foster cooperation or creativity or reduce suicidal ideation in teenage girls, or foster creativity in Broadway musical production companies. These are all famous examples in network science. It has been shown that the structure of the network matters, not just who the people are, but how they're connected. But what pattern of connections you have is specific to the topic.
So introducing people to your friends, trying to consciously create these kinds of positive networks.
Well, consciously, for many applications, fostering connections between your friends, like brokering introductions, is a good thing. Now, not always. I need to be very careful so I'm not misunderstood. But in order not to leave everyone with a very wishy-washy, oh, it depends, which is very academic. Just to say, one little thing you can think about, because many people probably think about, well, who do I know? That's good, but you can also think about how are the people you know connected to each other. And this is like the old-fashioned sort of dinner party, idea, which my favorite kind of adult entertainment is having two other couples over and having a dinner party with 6 people. God, isn't that now after 2 years in lockdown, like, just that sounds glorious, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, just have a conversation with 6 adults about, 8 is too many because then you get 2 conversations. 6 is just right because there's 1 conversation for everyone.
Yes, exactly. Something, there's in the burnout literature, commensality, eating dinner, breaking bread together has been shown to reduce burnout. So maybe it's for that. So we're almost out of time. There are a couple of more questions that have come in. And one of them is interesting. It's what happens to social networks in diasporic communities?
Well, it depends on whether they go in diaspora together or separately. So there's an interesting literature on two kinds of communities. Actually, there are many variants of that question. Let me start with a couple. One is let me start with three examples. One is after a calamity, communities that arise after a disaster. So there's a hurricane, for example, and everyone is united against a common enemy. We're all in the same boat. And often people talk about how there's this incredible, powerful connection. And there's a famous book whose title I'm blocking on by a woman whose name I'm blocking on. I'm trying to see if I can see it on my shelf here as I'm looking to my right real quick. I want to say it's like Communities After Disaster or something. That's not the right title. But anyway, she's looked at a whole host of such examples. So if you think about diaspora, we've all fled together, the volcano. So that's one kind of thing. The second kind of thing is targeted immigration. So, all the Greeks go to Chicago and live in Greektown 100 years ago, and they form an insular community. And they even live by village. So the Greeks that originate in this village live in this block, and the Greeks that originate in that village live in that block. That's a kind of, solidarity. And of course, then there's, the Jews and the Nigerians and the Koreans and the other diasporic communities. The Jews are a special case. I suppose the Ismaili Muslims are in that category as well. And the Roma are in that category. Who have a kind of identity that is related to their diasporic existence.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't think I answered the question. I kind of just.
Well, I think it's a hard one to answer because the context is so different in each case.
But I think what the person was getting at is this notion of solidarity within the group.
Yeah. As
a function in part of the fact that we're in diaspora,
Right.
And there's different variants of that.
Yeah. And there's some piece of shared identity there. Mm-hmm. So I have heard a lot of stuff. I mean, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm going to ask you one more question at the end, but a lot of people have been asking, can you foster these kinds of cascades for the betterment of our people, our populations, yes, for humanity at large? Yes. And one person is asking about spreading vaccine acceptance. And I've definitely heard, yes, of course you can. And in fact, I refer people to Nicholas's website, the Human Nature Lab, because there's some examples of that in terms of the global work that you're doing. And
yes,
it seems quite clear that you can do that.
Yes.
And then in terms of people, wanting to know, well, how can we do this locally? Some of the ideas I've heard you express is that we can actually, first of all, we can foster connections, and we can sort of change the structure of our interactions by the kinds of connections that we form, that we can also help sort of maybe modify the strength of those ties. I'm not quite sure. But I think the point is that whether through the spread of norms or behaviors or, whatever you want to call it, that happens all the time in organizations, and that we can be active participants. We don't have to think of ourselves as passive necessarily and making that happen. So, and I think that's actually very empowering.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to understand about this is that every time you make a positive change in your life, you affect others around you. And if these cascade effects ripple outward, you can have much bigger effects than you realize. And we've done many, many studies that show this to be the case.
Yeah. Well, I think I had one question more that I really wanted to ask you. Well, so I'm going to go for it. And then Stephanie will close us out in a second. But, I'm getting back to this idea of uncertainty and how to live with uncertainty, because certainly this year has been such an uncertain year. We're just immersed in that sense of just not knowing what to expect. And I was reading some poetry in the letters of Rilke to a young poet, And he says, don't try to find the answers now. The questions, you know, they can't be given. The answers to the questions can't be given because you wouldn't be able to live the answers. So, you know, live the questions now. Perhaps you may then gradually, without noticing, one day in the future, live into the answers. So I wanted to ask you, and this gets back to your mentor, Renee Fox, who wrote and talked and thought about uncertainty, but what questions are you living into right now?
Okay, I can't believe you're giving me Rilke because it's very hard to answer these questions. I mean, these are God.
Well, just tell me about the questions that are fascinating.
Well, one of the things I think on the uncertainty front, I mean, you know, I would say I'm on the neurotic end of the spectrum, and you know, it's taken me decades to tolerate uncertainty. So I'm not done yet. So I hardly am someone to give advice. I mean, professionally, I can tolerate uncertainty. You know, that is to say, when I was a clinician, you know, I don't see patients anymore, but when I did, you know, I was able to talk to patients about it. I was able to understand that my knowledge was limited. And when I do my research, you know, I'm able in the lab to tolerate uncertainty and not have premature closure and presume to know what we're going to find when we do experiments and so on. But in my personal life, it's not easy. So I don't have any special answer to that question, but I am learning to tolerate it more. So I would say what I'm leaning into is, you know, is learning to accept that things happen to me, and I can't control them
Right.
often, always, and perhaps to try to accept them or enjoy them.
Yeah, yeah, and to see with curiosity what might be discovered there, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have to close. I am so sorry. There were some wonderful questions in the chat. It was just very, very exciting to see people sort of thinking as you were talking. And I'm going to turn this over to Stephanie. Thank you so much, Nicholas.
Beth, thank you. It's so great to see you again in this format.
I know, it's really, really fun.
Exactly. Right.
So
Joe.
now it is time for Stephanie again. You're muted, Steph.
No, excuse me. I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Christakis. Thank you so much, Beth. That was really outstanding and so much to take in. I want to thank everyone for coming. Sorry to run a couple minutes late. We started a couple minutes late. We wanted you to get your free money's worth. And I just want to ask you all to look out for our post-webinar survey, which we'll be sending to an email inbox near you. We read every single comment. We love your feedback, so please take 2 minutes to fill it out for us. And if you enjoyed this, consider taking a look at our Compassion in Action conference, which is ongoing right now with twice weekly virtual sessions with everything related to advancing compassion in healthcare. We have scholarships available for the conference, so you can take a look. We're popping a link into the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And again, I just want to thank you both for such a phenomenal hour together. I hope your power comes back soon, Dr. Christakis,
Yes,
and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Thanks, Nicholas. It was really
Thanks,
great
Beth.
fun.